Cool. Hi everyone. So this workshop, which is going to be fairly brief, is just to explain what PM and LO speeches are, i.e. the first speeches in British parliamentary, some of the expectations that are placed upon these speeches. This is very much aimed at those people who are very new to debating and just want some clarification about what this role specifically involves. So I'm going to talk about specifically is just expectations. So what you and judges are expecting PM and LO speeches to do. Some advice on how to model and go about presenting speeches, both within just presentation itself, but also the kind of material you wish to cover and how you wish to cover it. And some examples, some explanation of things like preemption, a skill that is a little bit more advanced, but something that I think is quite useful to have in PM and LO speeches, alongside things like analysis. It's worthwhile pointing out that if you wish to target skills more specifically in PM speeches, you probably want to focus on things like framing and things like analysis. These are two workshops we already have somewhere else on the channel, so if you want to work deeper on those types of skills, I'd recommend you look at those. This is a video specifically just looking at the basic elements of these speeches. This will probably be most useful to you if you're very unfamiliar with BP in general, or having giving PM and LO speeches and wish to start just from the basics. Cool. So what are we expecting as judges of things like PM and LO speeches, and what are we expecting you to deliver? So the first thing is what we're expecting a first speaker to develop is a model of the debate, i.e. a comparative as well. So an explanation about what this motion is about, why we are debating it, and how it plays out in the world. So for instance, if you had a motion about banning drugs, this is just allowing the judges and setting the stage for them to what banning drugs actually means within the debate and explain from that what the balance of the debate is, i.e. what you want to happen on Gov and what you're expecting opposition to happen. It's quite a powerful position, a position that can be weaponized quite effectively to counteract the fact that opening government does not have that much time to interact with the rest of the room. And this is a skill that are expected to know, and it's a skill that, particularly within prep time, you want to focus on thinking about, as in what is this debate doing, what do I want this debate to do, and how am I going to explain to judges about why my impression of the debate is correct. You also want to express things like metrics. So here you want to explain within your argumentation why the argumentation is the thing that the debate should be about. So things like this house would ban drugs, a lot of argumentation can be generated. In a PM and LO speech, it's about explaining what the metrics of those arguments are, as in why you should care about them. This could be an argument of opening government for this house would ban drugs, would be drugs should be banned because they are damaging to people's health, personal livelihoods, and family. This is the metric opening government wishes to win on. Here's the analysis that proves that this model is effective and that this, as in the impacts I've just listed, personal wealth, etc., and personal relationships, are actually damaged. This is important to be very clear, and it can make it easier to deliver a speech when you're clear what your thing you're trying to prove is and why you're trying to prove it, as in why it's important to prove it. The expectation of PM and LO arguments in 95% of, well, not maybe that's not high, 75% of the time, is you want to not surprise the judges too much. Judges will have some conception about what the motion is, and debaters in the room will have some conception of the argumentation you run. CAs will also have intuitive argumentation that they built the motion around, or had flowed from the motion, depending on what kind of CA you have. So the intuitive arguments are the ones you're expected to run, and ones that I would recommend you run 3/4 of the time. So for instance, in this house with ban drugs, the intuitive arguments are we can effectively ban drugs. Drugs are bad for people. Here's why they're bad for people. Here's why we can effectively reduce them. There are other unintuitive arguments. Well, it depends on your intuition, actually, but there are some other arguments you could access that you may wish to experiment with. But having the basic core structure of intuitive arguments done will mean that the opening government position becomes much easier to do well in debating. An example of an unintuitive argument in this house with ban drugs may be a more principled argumentation that, whilst might ring to intuitions, can be quite hard to prove. So you could argue that you should ban drugs. You could argue that you should ban drugs because the state should not allow the systems to exist that actively harm individuals, and this is a violation of the state's contractual obligation to its citizenry. You can see that this is maybe an intuitive argument if you like to think about principles, but it's not an argument that you would expect an opening government team to run. you'd expect this to come out in closing, for instance. This does not mean you could not run it. You can do whatever you like. You're a free agent. But I probably recommend that running the save argumentation is probably the most sensible strategy in opening government or opposition. Cool. So let's take this in turn. So the first basic element of first speeches is modeling. So modeling is an explanation for how the world that you envision the debate takes place in actually takes place in. So this exists on two levels. The first is when you have motions like this House would, where an opening government team has fiat, as in an ability without the need to justify why it is likely to be the case, what the world looks like. So in the case of this House would ban drugs, an expectation for opening government and a useful ability that they have with this fiat is to explain what banning drugs actually looks like. So this could look like what kind of criminal prosecutions you would place in, what kind of distribution of resources you'd push into the war on drugs, how you could use drone and cyber technology to restrain the import and export of drugs, all allowing you to access some degree of efficacy in your ability to restrict the access people have to drugs. For instance, in a second example, in this House would allow companies to buy the right to economically failing cities. Here, the model could be describing what this actually looks like. So how are you going to allow companies to buy the rights? Here, you could have things like an auction system where individuals have to wager for the highest price in order to get some share of that company. You have to define here what an economically failing city looks like, as in you can use exemplification here, things like post-industrial towns, things like Flint or in places like Wisconsin, where there is destitution, where maybe councils or local districts are unable to fund education, are unable to fund basic sanitation, and therefore set the parameters of what the world looks like when motion takes place. Here this is just a good power to use, as in it makes the judges very clear what is in and out of the debate, but also bestows upon the Prime Minister a large amount of power to control where the debate exists in order to make it strategically easier for you to win an opening government. Strategy is a topic for another video. This is just what modeling means. Recognize that modeling for prime ministers can also exist beyond Wood motions, as in it can just exist through general characterization and explanation of what the world looks like. So for prefers, believes that, supports motions, or even predicts motions, it's about walking the judges through what the world looks like and why it looks the way it does. The second part, why the way it does, is uniquely reserved for modeling in non-Wood motions. So, and this House believes that it is in the interest of the US to leave the Iran nuclear deal. The model could be an explanation to what leaving the Iran nuclear deal likely looks like, and then explaining what the current state of America is and why it is aligned to that interests. This is how you implement a model from Prime Minister, using an explanation of how you're doing it, but also characterization of what the world looks like. Similarly, within Leader of Opposition speeches, you have this similar amount of power a Prime Minister does, with some caveats to a certain extent. The first is, within Wood motions, Leader of Oppositions have counterprop fiat, as in they can explain that they can do something else with the same amount of power opening government has. As in, if opening government in this House would ban social housing in low-income areas, is naturally using their fiat to, unsurprisingly, build social housing in low-income areas, you could use similar and different fiat to explain why you can use those resources in low-income areas in better ways. There are two things you have to do in counterprops. The first is the explanation you're giving has to be mutually exclusive. So it can't happen also on opening government side. So for instance, you couldn't say this House, instead of this House building social areas and low income areas, we would instead incentivize private individuals to build land in those areas instead. That can theoretically also happen on government side and is not a successful execution of counter fiat. A better execution of counter fiat was just explaining where else you're going to build those social houses as a limited resource, i.e. you wouldn't build them in low-income areas, you'd build them in a distribution of other areas. Some of them would be low income, some of them wouldn't be low income. Or you can play around with the fiat based on the creativity of the case you wish to run. In the case of this House would aggressively fund into research on human cloning, you could argue mutually exclusively that you would put that funding into other means, as in maybe into other types of research, or potentially you could defend on opposition side, I don't know, banning human cloning in the first place. This is potentially sufficient fiat, sufficient comparative power. The first thing that you have, sorry, the second thing you have to worry about, other than is this as much power, is this as mutually exclusive, is this as much power? As in, you can't explain that you're going to do something that is beyond the realms open government had power to do in the first place. So the example I gave could be a testament to an example where people may challenge this. As in, they may say that aggressively funding requires a certain level of power, but banning something requires more power. There's a debate of whether or not that is true, but generally speaking, you don't want to encroach upon higher fiat than you would otherwise be allowed to have. For instance, if a motion was this house, and indeed was build social housing low income areas, you can't on opposition side say this house would, instead of building social housing, buy up all of the private housing land and put them into cooperative ownership such that no person could ever have to pay rent in those low income areas again. That's not an equal level of influence in fiat, and therefore would be an illegitimate counterprop and would be considered a squirreling. The general heuristic here is you have to think about, if you were in the situation of being able to build social housing, what resources would you have? Where else could those resources be placed into? And why placing those resources into different areas can't also be done by government side. Counterprops aren't always that useful. They can sometimes be quite useful, but it's generally the case in leader of opposition speeches, counterprops are not things you want to strive for. You may wish instead just to strive for the status quo, which is the defense that often happens on opposition bench. Additionally, in characterization can also occur in leader of opposition speeches, specifically counter-characterization. Here, the important part of leader of opposition speeches is to use the same degree of power of characterization to defend and to characterize the world in retaliation to the way Prime Minister is talking about it. Naturally, the Prime Minister's speech, because they wish to make an argument for proposition, will not always create a more realistic or balanced impression of the world. They may choose to leave out bad aspects of the world, as in ways in which this model could go wrong. As in this house would ban drugs, the Prime Minister may make characterization on the harms that drugs have, as in they are debilitating, they can empower criminal gangs. Whereas in leader of opposition, you could use your model characterization power to explain why, in actual some cases, drugs do very good things. Things like cannabinoids can help people with chronic pain. The fact there are other regulations that you can use to stop criminal gangs. The fact that a lot of individuals who sell drugs that would otherwise be massively unemployed and given to worse types of crime, which may have worse types of harms to people. Here is an exemplification of how you can implement both a model within Prime Minister, but also in leader of opposition. This is a major role that you have in the debate, and it can make it really much easier for you to win in these positions if you're using this power. It is an expectation placed upon you. Naturally, it is a skill that requires careful effort to master, and it is a very powerful skill if you can use it strategically, and hence why in some ways these positions are the most powerful in debating. Cool. Other than modeling, how should you generally structure a Prime Minister's speech? So the first thing you should probably do is to build this characterization and model at the start of your speech. Set out the landscape of the world, explain what is happening in the world on both sides so the judges know where they stand. The second thing is probably to therefore develop argumentation and prove efficacy of the arguments. Here it could be just something as simple as signposting by saying in the motion this house would ban drugs. First, I'm going to prove to you that drugs are harmful, and second, I'm going to prove to you that banning them would make people have less access to them and thus would become less harmful. So the second is an example of proving efficacy. Why actually banning drugs would prevent people getting their hands on drugs in a meaningfully way on quantity. You could also argue that banning drugs may make drugs safer or make criminal policing more effective, etc. All of these are proving efficacy of the policy you're implementing. The last is to justify the metrics, as in once you prove that you can ban drugs, you then need to prove in a PM speech that banning drugs in effect to stop people being harmed is something that you should care about in the debate. Here you can use the power of characterization to why drugs are harmful, but also illustrating why drugs are actually harmful, as in all the stuff I mentioned previously. Similarly, the leader of opposition speech should be similarly matched. You have a model and you can have a model and counter characterization fiat to explain what the world actually looks like in a more balanced or even more up-weighted way. You wish to prove efficacy of the inverse arguments, as in this house would ban drugs, why it would be ineffective to ban drugs, because drugs would still get a sufficient amount of distribution, or maybe become worse, as in become less safe, empowers criminal gangs. And then similarly justifying those metrics, i.e. why we should care about the power of criminal gangs, why actually it would become worse drugs, and the quality of drugs and how bad and harmful they are is something that should weigh most in the debate. This is the general structure you should follow, and it's probably the most reliable structure. Messing this up and having, trying to implement too much can mean that you don't do the basics correct and you just lose out on a debate. If you've proved something effectively and you've explained why that thing is important, that is usually enough to win most rooms in most debate competitions. Other than modeling and characterization, a key aspect, particularly of leader of opposition speeches, can be rebuttal. So we already have a workshop on rebuttal given by Path that I think is quite excellent. But just to illustrate what I think rebuttal should do in Prime Minister and LO speeches, as opposed to other speeches, is as follows. First, I think the major emphasis of PM and LO speeches should be to develop a case. You should far more prioritize your time in proving an argument and proving why the argument only occurs on your side and proving why the argument is important. Deprioritize rebuttal responses in LO and probably deprioritize preemptive responses in PM. These probably should be best left to the deputy speeches, which are responsive speakers working out how things are interacting. We have videos already expressing them. However, there are some times when rebuttal is necessary and useful. There are two examples here. The first could be, you could think about examples where the first speaker has modeled or has substantively developed the debate in an insanely off-clash way. By off-clash, I mean things that are counterintuitive, things that don't directly interact with the material you want to run, and are probably disaligned to what the spirit of the motion is. Here, or the spirit of the motion is, but also the motion that you want to have is. So for instance, in a motion, in this house with ban drugs, let's say opening government exclusively focused on reducing criminal activity, whereas you wish to exclusively focus on the harms of drugs themselves. Here, some amount of rebuttal may be necessary to explain why either one, the judges should not care as much about the power of criminal networks, or indeed, in terms of weighing, explaining why your version of reality to where in your world the harms of drugs are worse is more important than criminal networks. Here's when some level of rebuttal will be necessary. A second and more insane example is where, if in this house would ban drugs, opening government stood up and says, we're going to ban some drugs, like, I don't know, heroin, but we're not going to ban things like hallucinogens. This is an example of a squirrel in the debate. Leader of opposition is the only position in the debate where you are allowed to challenge whether or not a model is legitimate. This is a primary thing you need to do in order for you to advance in debates where teams squirrel. If you don't challenge a model that appears absolutely insane, you're probably making it really hard for anyone on opposition bench to win the debate. As in, if you allow opening government to get away with this squirrel, you are not just one, more likely to have a closing government team that stands up and points out the squirrel, meaning your deputy and your rebuttal against opening government won't land, but you're also more likely, therefore, to be off-clash against opening government, because people often use squirrel power in order to get out of the arguments they need to make. As in, if you think about the reason someone would have fiated only banning certain drugs, is an implicit concession that they don't wish to argue that there are good drugs out there that could be beneficial for people. They just want to focus on the bad drugs. You want to, as an LO speaker specifically, think about what is a legitimate and illegitimate challenge, trust your instincts, because like most people, including judges, they are just humans, and they will think about whether or not this is intuitive. If it doesn't seem intuitive or in the spirit of the motion to you, challenge it. Best to be safe than sorry. Third example of when this might be necessary is just to potentially overwork other speakers. So you may wish to add responsive challenges to Prime Minister as LO in instances in which you want the DPM to have too much things to do. They therefore, if you rebut PM, have to work on rebuilding their material as opposed to destroying your material as opposed to weighing. This could be a strategic choice you make, particularly in instances where there isn't on-clash material. If there are two different metrics that exist in top half, i.e. the crime and quality of drugs as I talked about, but but you can't think of a compelling reason why your metric should weigh above their metric, rebuttal can be helpful in mitigating and reducing the certainty of their arguments as a secondary path to victory. The way in which you can win a debate is not just by justifying your own metrics, as in an abstract of why they should matter, but also justifying why they are most certain or likely to accrue as a secondary way in which to win the debate on analytical certainty. So rebuttal can be necessary in those 3-4 instances, but broadly they usually are left deprioritized to your deputy. Another skill that you may wish to impose, which I think is perhaps more important for prime ministers than leader of oppositions, but it's probably both useful for both, is to at least think about why the arguments you're going to choose to run in prep and indeed to deliver in your speech actually not just matter, but matter more than other arguments in the debate. As in, debates are often set up where there are multiple arguments that can be run and multiple compelling arguments that could win the debate. You are unable in 7 minutes to express why all of the 6 or anywhere from 2 to 6 impacts that could accrue only accrue on your side and are beneficial for your side. The more impacts in your speech, the less well developed they are, the more they're going to be vulnerable to responsive challenges and analytical extensions. So it's often best to focus on 1 or 2 impacts and explain why those arguments and impacts matter more than other arguments. Here you can integrate this into impacting in your speeches. Here you could explain why a motion causes an impact, prove it analytically, explain why it is true, i.e. justifying the metric, and then explain why it matters, justifying the metric again, but then explain why it matters more than other things. Here in prep, you want to focus on what other impacts exist in the round, and have your deputy speaker provide you reasoning, or it depends who's better at it, but often it's the deputy, provide reasoning to why that thing matters more than other things, why reducing crime matters more than the quality of the drug, perhaps because it's prior. We also, i.e., if the criminal network is weaker, your aspect of getting bad drugs is lower because it's less likely to be spiked, etc. We have a whole video on weighing, but it might be something you wish to integrate into it. Depending on who your partner is and who your deputy is and what kind of skills they have and what kind of dynamics you wish, you might want to rest upon your deputy to do the most of the heavy specific clash weighing and instead have more meta weighing, as in justification for why the impacts matter broadly, which is a form of justification for why the metrics are true and important, i.e. why we should broadly care about reducing crime, rather than more specific nitty-gritty about why we should care more about reducing a type of crime or crime over empowerment of drugs, etc. So this is a skill you probably, especially when you're becoming more advanced in your PM and LO speeches, probably want to try to start including, but at the very least you should have a conceptual idea of why your argument is important within prep, and this is why weighing is important to integrate within the prep of PM and LO speeches. So, as a summary, PM and LO positions are very formulaic. They can have a very bog standard set of ways in which you're going about your speeches, and ways that mean the position can be boring to some people, but can be incredibly powerful and rewarding to others. As in, it goes from model to efficacy analysis, to metric, to justifying the metric. It's important for PM and LO speeches to focus on clarity in the model and clarity in burden satisfaction. You don't want to be too clever, but you don't want to be too unclear. Don't try to do too much, and instead just focus on actually taking the judge through what the world looks like. It will benefit the entire debate in the long run, and you'll be rewarded by the judges for that. Things like clarity are obviously important, but as is confidence. PM especially can be a very intimidating position where you only have 50 minutes of prep, and you don't have that much constructive power after you sit down. Producing a degree of confidence can manifest confidence within your own argumentation, as in it's often true that if judges feel as if you're underconfident, they will feel as if you yourself know that your arguments aren't very good and may deprioritize you in rankings. A lot of debating can actually be quite about a psychological game with you and the judges, therefore confidence is quite key. After you've mastered the basics, PM and LOs are very easy to drill, but can be quite hard to master. As in, it's quite easy to find a motion and prep for 50 minutes and deliver a 7-minute speech and think back upon it. So there are definitely positions that you can excel at if you wish to dedicate more time to them. Recognize finally, as you proceed more in PM and LO speeches hopefully, thinking preemptively is crucial. So once you get good at proving an argument and justifying a metric, the limitation in your PM and LO speeches may be about strategy and strategic reasoning. This is not an indictment on your poverty of PM and LO speeches. If you're getting to the point at which you're losing debates because of strategy, it suggests that you're doing a lot of the basics very well, and you're probably often breaking or getting firsts or seconds and OGs and OOs if you're able to do the basics very well, as in satisfy burdens, have good characterization power, have a good instinct of the debate, all things that are hard to master but can be quite easy to drill. That is the basic of PM and LO speeches. Hopefully this find it useful. If you want to target specific skills, we have many other videos that hopefully you will find useful. See you around.